All right. I would like to call the meeting of the Scientific Advisory Committee to order, and I welcome everyone to today's meeting. Just a few reminders before we get started. The first is that for members of the committee that are using an audio-visual connection, please ensure that you stay on video during the meeting and also to mute your microphones when you're not speaking. There's a recent or a change as of July 1st of 2024 to the Virginia Public Meeting Laws that now considers a member to be absent from any portion of the meeting during which visual communication with the member is voluntarily disconnected or otherwise fails. So it's very important that we all keep our cameras on. Secondly, I would just remind everyone, since it is a virtual meeting, to please speak up so that you can be heard clearly. And lastly, if you make a motion or second a motion, if you would please state your name during that so that we can have a record of who made the motion. Okay, so the first order of business today is adoption of the agenda. You should have all received a copy of the agenda from Ms. Strobel. I hope everyone's had a chance to review it. If there are any changes to the agenda, please speak now. Hearing no changes, I would ask for a motion to adopt the draft agenda.
Ken Zersi, so moved.
A second.
Second, Randall Beatty.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? So the motion passes and the agenda has been adopted. The next order of business is approval of the minutes from the April meeting. Ms. Strobel sent a link to the draft minutes, and on Monday, October 7th, she sent a revised draft of the minutes that just made some revisions to include the locations of the members that attended remotely and updated the in-person attendance. So I hope everyone's had a chance to review the draft minutes. I would ask if there are any proposed changes to the revised minutes. Hearing none, I will ask for a motion to approve the draft minutes.
So moved.
I'm sorry, who was that? I didn't hear that.
Christopher Bomarito.
Thank you, Chris. Is there a second to approve the minutes?
I second Peter Valone.
Thank you, Dr. Valone. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the vote to approve the minutes from the April meeting passes. Next on the agenda, we have the chair's report. I do not have a report for this meeting, so we'll move on to the next item. The next item is to hear from the Trace Evidence Subcommittee, their report, and I will call on Mr. Bomarito to bring his report from the July 23rd, 2024 meeting.
On July 23rd, the subcommittee met. It was myself, Mr. Beatty, and Ms. Forey. We met to discuss validation of gas efficiency method validation, which was very good. It's a method that's being used to develop more objective criteria for identification of gasoline. And this method's been taught in workshops throughout the country. And so the subcommittee members had no issues with that method. And then I'd also asked the subcommittee members to review the trace evidence methods that are in the manual. This is not asked by the state. This is something that I had asked. I wanted everybody have eyes on it at some point. That was on the subcommittee. Everything looks great. It's and so I think everything in trace evidence realm, at least on the surface, seems very good. That's my report. I believe the
Thank you.
minutes will be available through Elise if they're not, haven't been distributed already.
Okay, are there any questions for Mr. Bomarito or the subcommittee? Okay, I don't see any, so I would call for a motion to approve the report from the Trace Evidence Subcommittee.
Motion to approve the report, Pete Balone.
Bill DeMuth, second.
Thank you. I believe we may need to call for a vote individually for this report. Is that correct?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will call each individual and you can state your vote. Randall Beatty,
Aye.
Mr. Bomarito, Ms. Grow. Aye. Dr. Corrado,
Aye.
Mr. DeMuth.
Aye.
Ms. Forey,
Aye.
Director Jackson,
Aye.
Dr. Maha,
I have to abstain because I just got my computer working so I could hear you and see you.
thank you. Mr. Myers,
Aye.
Ms. Ramirez,
Aye.
Dr. Valone,
Aye.
and Mr. Zersi.
Aye, with special thanks to the committee.
Thank you.
Okay, so I believe that was all in favor. There were none opposed. Therefore, the motion passes and the report has been approved. All right, the next item of business is the Controlled Substances Subcommittee report. And I would call on Mr. Myers to bring his report from the October 7th, 2024 meeting.
All right, good morning, everyone. Dr. LeBeau, Mr. Bomarito, and myself make up the Controlled Substances Subcommittee. We met yesterday and reviewed the verification plan on the quantitative analysis of fentanyl using GC-FID-MS. And we also reviewed the method validation summary of the addition of Delta-7 and cis-Delta-9 THC isomers to the existing semi-quantitative GC-FID-MS method. So we reviewed those. The department presented them, and we had no additional recommendations or improvements for the department. So we closed our review of those two documents. And that ended our meeting. That's my report.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Myers or the subcommittee? Hearing none, I will ask Ms. Strobel to, I'm sorry. I first need to call for a motion to approve the report from the Controlled Substances Subcommittee.
Motion to approve, Pete Balone.
George Maha, second.
Thank you. I will now ask Ms. Strobel to call for a vote.
Okay, Mr. Beatty,
Aye.
Mr. Bomarito, Mr. Bomarito,
I said aye.
thank you. Ms. Grow. Dr. Corrado,
Aye.
Mr. DeMuth,
Aye.
Ms. Forey,
Aye.
Director Jackson,
Aye.
Dr. Maha,
Aye.
Mr. Myers,
Aye.
Ms. Ramirez,
Aye.
Dr. Valone,
Aye.
and Mr. Zersi.
Aye,
Thank you.
Thank you. The motion passes and the report has been approved. For the next item on the agenda, I will turn to Director Jackson to give her director's report.
All right. Thank you. Let me share my screen real quick. And somebody could just let me know if you can see that. Okay, perfect. All right. So I can get my slides to move. There we go. So along with forensic science laboratories across the country, we in Virginia celebrated Forensic Science Week, although we couldn't contain or schedule all of the things we did into 1 week for a variety of reasons. So we had things that kind of spilled over the week before and the week after. I've put on the slide the proclamation from Governor Youngkin that called it Forensic Science Week for the state of Virginia as well as nationally. So we did several things. We had our service awards where we celebrated the service milestones of, 5, 10, 30, 35 was our longest tenure during this service awards. Lisa Schiermeyer Wood in our forensic biology section, who has worked, I think, with some of you on this committee. She celebrated 35 years, which was great. We did provide tours through the there's an On the Square program in Virginia with things kind of on Capitol Square. We're a little off of Capitol Square, but we provided tours for state employees, which were very well received. And we also held section meetings where we brought in folks from all 4 locations so that they could learn together and interact with each other and get to know each other a little better. And we did that for controlled substances, latent prints, and firearms, kind of right around Forensic Science Week. And then our DNA training is actually happening right now as we speak down the road, and did some other little games and recognition type of things. But overall, it was a good week. Our central laboratory capital project, building the new central laboratory that will house our current central laboratory, as well as all of our statewide operations and the central district of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, as well as their statewide operations, is still on schedule. And so it's really starting to take shape so that you can see what the spaces are going to look like. And so we've taken supervisors out so that they can get a feel for that. And so that's just a little map of where it's located, but there's a pretty new little drone video that was taken. And so this is the facility as it's being built. There are 2 big sections. The part that's kind of towards the bottom, that is the section where the whole bottom floor is the medical examiner's office and all of their operations. And the second floor there is the training facility. And the third floor of that side of the building is all the statewide operations for both DFS and OCME. And kind of that's where you would go in, is through that sort of courtyard in the middle. And then the central laboratory is what is this big behemoth side over now that is now on the bottom. And so it's 3 stories, with the 4th top being the penthouse with all of the mechanical systems, which are being installed as we speak. You can see there, that's a loading dock where there's going to be both a place where vans can go up for our evidence vans, as well as a place where a semi-truck could back up into the loading dock. And then it's coming around the other side, and we'll see the Sally Port over on the medical examiner side, where they'll be able to deliver the bodies at all times of day, right there where you'll drive through that kind of overhang. So anyway, I just thought this was a more illustrative thing than just a static picture. And so anyway, we're very excited about it, and we're glad that it seems to be making good progress. So since we met last, we did have 4 sessions of our training for attorneys and judges. And we focused on breath alcohol and toxicology training. This was a 4-hour training, and it was held at each one of our laboratory locations. And we expanded it so that there were 40 attendees that could come instead of 30, since there were a few less hands-on things. And we decided that we were a little overwhelmed with everything going on. And so we didn't schedule any trainings for the fall. And so we'll need to work now to see what we're going to schedule for next year. So we are moving forward with being able to use the pre-log functionality of Forensic Advantage, TCSC's product, which is what we have been using for many years as our LIMS system. It's been a long road to get to where this is functional for us, but we have now done some preliminary beta testing with a couple of agencies where we've had evidence that was actually submitted, and it went all the way through to where you could write a report, and so that's certainly successful. We have a couple little things that are being fixed in the new version of FA, which is scheduled to be released later this week. And hopefully in that process, they will have only fixed things and not unfixed things that need to be refixed. For any of you that have done a LIMS project, you know that this is something that is highly likely that they will have unfixed things. But fingers crossed, we're very close, and we have some staff that is going to be focusing on training law enforcement on how to utilize this functionality, and we'll probably beta test it further and more broadly with a couple of agencies before we go whole hog with the online pre-log. But we are excited about it. It's something that agencies have been asking for quite a long time. We did submit, I can't remember now exactly the date, but in June or so, we submitted our and released our drug report that we have done each year that is showing the trends of drugs that are seized drugs that are submitted across the Commonwealth to our agency that were submitted within that calendar year 23 time period. So not surprisingly, there were increases in illicit opioids, there were increases in cocaine and some of the designer drugs. That looks like it's a really giant percentage increase, which it was, but the number of those is much lower than some of the other drug categories. So it's really not as big of an increase as it appears by that percentage. But that is on our website. It shows different trends, and this is just some of the graphics from the report for illicit synthetic opioids, which are mostly fentanyl and some fentanyl analogs, but nitazines would also be included in that, and how they have increased across the Commonwealth over the this shows since 2014. And we also have it broken down by the state police districts as well as court districts. So the court districts being on the right-hand side where it's a little more granular information, and that is showing by population of 100,000 people, so that you can see it provides a more apples to apples comparison to areas, say in far West Virginia, where the population is very low, but the percentage of drugs per the population is much higher. And then our top 10, those were the most common substances that we did identify in 2023. About 3 years ago, methamphetamine overtook cocaine, and they're actually pretty close to each other now, but meth is still in the lead, and fentanyl is up at number 3. So one thing that I had shown this at our last meeting, this is our new case statistics dashboard. And so I show it again because we're working on a drug dashboard. We wanted to get away from doing that annual report that's very, the information is fairly dated because you have to wait until you've analyzed all the cases from 2023 before you can do the report. And so we're working on using the data that we submit to the NIFLS program to come up with a drug dashboard that is using the same kind of technology that we used for our case statistics. And so we're doing that project with OGDA. And this is just sort of the initial draft of what one of the things that we were talking about doing, where this information would get updated monthly. kind of towards a little into the month after it has been cleaned a little bit, since we are using drug categories instead of specific drugs. To make it so that it'll actually fit in a dashboard, and also we want to make sure that we don't have any identifying information that would be up on the website. So we don't want, say if it was broken down by some agency, we don't want somebody to say, oh, look, I know my neighbor got busted for this, and so that was his case. So we're not going to have anything where we have numbers that is below 4. We're going to say that there are too few numbers to report. So hopefully next time we meet, I will be able to demonstrate the new drug dashboard. So speaking of case statistics, our fiscal year ends on June 30th. So these are the statistics for our case submissions for what was submitted between July 1st of 23 through June 30 of 24. And so our controlled substances submissions, or seized drugs, have started increasing again. They are still down significantly from pre-pandemic, but they are definitely starting to make a rebound. And there are several things that are happening with enforcement around the state where there's a focus on the opioids, especially fentanyl. And so I think, that type of focus on enforcement will continue to drive increases in the amount of submissions for seized drugs. Our digital and multimedia evidence, we're pretty stable actually with the number of cases that are submitted for that. Law enforcement does a lot of their own digital evidence. So we have 6 examiners, and we provide that service to anyone who needs it, but particularly agencies that don't have some of the tools that are smaller, or we do more complicated things where the tools haven't been effective, and we try, other things like chip-off technology or that type of thing. Firearms and tool marks, our submissions are definitely down due to the increase of law enforcement agencies with NIBIN, but our number of comparison cases definitely has not dropped, which are the more time-consuming cases. Forensic biology, that's the area where we're still struggling, and we're definitely just continuing to get more cases than we did before, and we haven't gotten, or until the last couple of years, we had not gotten additional staff, and so now we are trying to work through that. Latents is fairly stable with submissions, and toxicology is probably, the submissions should go back up now that the medical examiner is no longer outsourcing their overdose cases. Let's see, and trace actually is also pretty stable just over time. So these are our workload statistics for the month that just ended, and you will see that some of our turnaround times are much longer than we would like. DNA in particular is much longer than most anyone would want. Digital and multimedia evidence, that actually fluctuates, but right now, the last couple of months, the average turnaround times have been very high because we do have we had 2 positions that were empty, and so we went through training the 2 out of the 6 positions. They are now all fully trained, so we are starting to work through some of the older cases, and so when you work through older cases, your turnaround times look terrible for a while before they get better. One of the things that I did want to talk about is just, we do have some plans for increasing our DNA capacity. The first thing is that, and I believe I talked about this before, is creating a PERC processing unit. PERC's in Virginia, Physical Evidence Recovery Kit. Those are our sexual assault kits, and they are, they're all packaged exactly the same. They have the same types of samples in them, so they lend themselves well to a triage sort of workflow. And so we have created 5 new forensic science biologist positions who will be the screeners of the PERCs. So they'll be developing the profiles, and they will be able to write reports for very simple cases, and anything complex requiring interpretation would be submitted back to the originating laboratory for a forensic scientist. We did get 2 additional forensic scientist positions in the most recent budget, and both of those are in the interview process right now. One of them is in Northern and one is in Western. And we have plans, we're working with procurement to come up with a new contract. We haven't had one for a while, to be able to outsource some DNA cases to a private laboratory. And our plan is to focus on cases that are non-persons cases. And we would be submitting those from all of our laboratories just to reduce the number of cases that we have in our backlog. For court, I just wanted to show our court statistics summary. It's a couple interesting things. You can look at it at your leisure, but controlled substances and toxicology, they certainly received the most subpoenas. And forensic biology, they have forensic biology and latent prints. They are the highest for, if they appear, they generally testify. So for latent prints, it's 84%, and forensic biology, it's 78, firearms at 75. So if those folks are going to court, it's very likely that they will testify, unlike poor toxicology, where 11% of the time they will provide testimony. And certainly, if you look at the number of times that they had to appear, it's far more in toxicology than any other section. For our budget, just really quickly, we had a balance at the end of FY23 that we had carried over to FY24 to pay for the new evidential breath instruments that we are in the process of procuring. We were not able to finish that procurement, so we're going to be asking to carry that money over again, and I'm not sure how that's going to go, but that would certainly be wonderful if we were able to do that so that we could pay for the instruments outright in FY25. Otherwise, we may use there's a treasury program called the MELP program, which is basically a way to finance large equipment purchases. So it's how state police buys their plane and some of that kind of stuff. We did get notification recently of 2 awards, or 3 awards actually, for the next grant season. We have heard now from the CBER program for just over $2 million for funding that is focused on DNA. And so that's a block grant. And of course, we are pretty reliant on that funding. And we also have gotten 2 grants for our breath alcohol and toxicology sections that go through the highway safety. It's federal highway safety money that goes through the Virginia DMV. So both of those are funding staff, as well as the breath alcohol. It's funds some training and some travel for law enforcement to be able to come for the training where they get licensed to be a breath alcohol operator. All right, and so that is what I had to share. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything going on with the department, and I know the DTS folks will be sharing things as well.
Thank you, Linda. Are there any questions for Director Jackson? I think it's great. Oh, go ahead, Erin. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Can you remind me the count for the number of submissions? Is that per case, or is that multiple submissions for each case included in that number?
So there are 2 different kinds of submissions that I talk about. If we're talking about our case submissions, that was just for all the sections, that is per case. So a case would have maybe, it could have 10 items in it. It could have 1 item in it. It could, but it is that if a case requires both latent prints and DNA, it would count for a case for latents, and it would count for a case for DNA. In the drug report statistics, those are counted separately, where it counts, like if there was a sample that contained cocaine and heroin, it would count once for cocaine and it would count once for heroin. But if there was if there were multiple items of heroin within one case, that would only count one.
Thank you.
Other questions? Sorry, I made my screen where I could see everyone now because before I couldn't. I just want to just point out that I like your LIMS pre-log project. I think that's really helpful. I know when we instituted that, it really was great for our submitting agencies. So I'm glad to see that you'll be able to do that soon. All right. Thank you so much, Director Jackson. Our next item of business is to hear from the Division of Technical Services. And the first person we'll hear an update from is Ms. Lohman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and then we will not be able to see you. What did you say? Okay, I will get started. There's a slight change to the technical services update agenda. We have our newest program area defined as evidence receiving, and we have spared her having to provide a report to you all today. So you will get a lot of information on the changes that have happened to evidence receiving at your next update. For our accreditation, I'm pleased to report that we were notified during Forensic Science Week on September 16th of our continuation of accreditation. Our updated scopes and certificates are on our website. We are currently scheduled for an off-site document review in 2025, and then a full accreditation reassessment would happen in 2026. Our forensic training section, which provides the Forensic Science Academy, or the FSA, as mandated by the statutes of the Commonwealth of Virginia. The 112th session graduated this past summer. The annual retraining, which brings in law enforcement who are graduates of the FSA from all over the state, happened early September, and they receive updates about various case studies, forensic genetic genealogy updates, DNA updates, department-wide updates. And that was a success. Director Jackson did address all the attendees as well. We did start the 113th Forensic Science Academy session just after that, and they will graduate November the 15th. So certainly, if any of our Scientific Advisory Committee members are in town and you'd love to attend, we would be happy to have you. We have currently the forensic training manager and 2 forensic trainer senior positions. One was vacated earlier this year and has been refilled, and that individual started in the middle of the summer. So he is getting up to speed on the instructional portion. He was a graduate, as all our forensic trainers are. We did thankfully receive continuation funding for our part-time forensic trainer, so that individual can continue to assist with both the Forensic Science Academy and the short courses. Having that depth does allow for the ability for us to have short courses, sometimes concurrently with the Forensic Science Academy sessions itself, because if you'll recall, that is a 9-week consecutive course for these individuals. So they'll come to us, 12 individuals will come to us from around the state, be away from their families, their agency, and learn all about the department's capabilities, as well as what are the best samples to collect, preserve, and submit from crime scenes. We continue to have a fair amount of members active on the different OSACs. As you can see, I don't believe there have been any changes since our last talk, but we try to stay abreast of what's happening there and be supportive of these endeavors to have increased consistency throughout forensic science. Our chemistry research staffing, the chemistry research section in general, very busy. fully staffed, have a bunch of new positions that came or have been filled through whether it was from the grant or the OD2AS funding. There was also a legislative change, one response to legislative changes general fund. So that was good. And so the chemistry staffing continues to grow, and they needed to grow because, as you can see, they have numerous projects in the pipeline. We are, as the SAC subcommittee chair spoke about, we have the fentanyl quantitation that's in process. And I don't have to read all of these to you, but should you have any other questions about the variety of projects, and these are a mix between grant funded projects as well as general fund projects and things that are happening throughout the state and what we need to best service our customers. We did have a recent disclosure to our accrediting body, and this was with respect to, there was a CTS proficiency test in which we did receive an unexpected result out of our Western firearms section. We initiated a corrective action. We reported it to our accrediting body as we're required to. We did temporarily suspend firearms comparisons in our Western laboratory for a short period of time. We did resume the comparisons later in the summer after we had successfully remediated the individual who was the verifier of that proficiency test. We were in the process of also remediating the proficiency test taker, but that individual, even though they were very close to completing those actions, retired and has separated from the agency. You will hear more about Smith versus Arizona from Counsel Amy Jenkins shortly, but one thing that we have changed on our reports was we have instances where we have an instrument support, and that's an analysis that's performed by somebody who's qualified to perform the testing, but is not going to be the examiner who issues the certificate of analysis, who issues the report. And just to be clear, that individual's name is going to now appear on our certificate of analysis, and it'll say that an instrument support was conducted by Alka Lohman, and it'll just be on the report. Should that individual be needed for any courtroom testimony, then their name is right there for ease of subpoenaing. But presumably that won't affect very many cases. That's not something we do very often, but just an increased transparency in our reporting. That sums up what I have, and I will turn it over to Ms. Weimer for the chemistry section update.
Morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about the chemistry program, which includes controlled substances or seized drugs and trace evidence analysis. And we're going to be starting with the trainee update. In trace evidence, we are still recovering from a retirement and a promotion. So anytime we have people who have 3, 4, 5 subdisciplines in trace evidence, it takes a long time to gain back that capacity. So we are in training, and you will continue to hear me talk about who's in training for many meetings to come. Right now in the central laboratory, we have one trainee in tape. She's expected to complete that by the end of this year. We had 2 trainees in hair. One completed their training in September. The other, due to a number of different reasons, including extended medical leave, that training is expected to be completed later, and we'll finish that in 2025. We had 2 trainees in glass. One has completed their training in August and now continues to train in fracture match, sequence of impact, and directions of impact. They're expected to complete that training in December. And the other glass trainee will finish their training in second quarter of 2025. This is the table that kind of outlines all of our capabilities currently in trace evidence. If they are qualified, it's an X. If it's training, it's a O. And then those that have just data interpretation capability only, because certain instruments are only in one lab. For example, our SEM EDS or scanning electron microscopy, that's only in our central laboratory. So all of the examiners that are in Eastern and Western, for example, just have data interpretation only ability. But what we're striving for here is that we have a minimum of at least 3 qualified examiners per subdiscipline. And so we have some shortfalls currently. Primer residue, tape, fibers are just examples. So we also have 1 position in recruit in our central laboratory, and we hope to fill that with a qualified primer residue examiner. In terms of trainees for controlled substances, we have 1 trainee in the central laboratory expected to complete their training in November. We had 2 that have completed training, 1 from our Western laboratory that completed in July, and 1 from our Northern laboratory that completed their training in April. We had 2 new trainees that basically just started, and we expect to finish their training in July of next year. And Eastern Laboratory, we have no trainees or positions in recruit at the moment. For training in trace evidence, we are actually providing training. So some of our examiners will be providing training at the upcoming MAFS, single A MAFS. We're providing a fire debris data interpretation workshop. They're going to be looking at, or they did look at, excuse me, recent information on data interpretation, ASTM standardization, and really looking at complex data. That was provided September 9th. We will also have 2 examiners that are going to be providing a workshop at the upcoming ASTE-NEEFS meeting, the American Society of Trace Evidence Examiners, Northeastern Association of Forensic Scientists. There will be a joint meeting coming in October 22nd. And we're going to have 2 examiners who are providing a primer residue data interpretation workshop. They're going to be looking at practical ID of environmental particles that are similar to gunshot residue and other unusual elemental profiles. We continue to work on sufficiency of data for identification of ignitable liquids. As you heard earlier, the Trace Evidence Subcommittee had a meeting in July, and the review was closed, and that was really looking at the identification of gasoline specifically. We got a subsequent grant, and that work has now extended to the medium range ignitable liquids, which is the 2nd most identified range of ignitable liquids that follow gasoline. So just a heads up that we're going to need that future subcommittee meeting probably in 2025. As for controlled substances, we had our statewide section meeting September 17th through the 19th. We had a tour of Customs and Border Protection Lab. We did a mushrooms workshop, had professional meeting teachbacks, and we had a lot of presentations, and that was very well received. Everybody seems to be giving very positive reviews. We also have current training this week, October 8th through the 10th, where we attend online symposium from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC. And there's 3 thematic sessions, 1 for each day. You've seen this slide previously from me. We have the semi-quantitative method for analysis of marijuana and cannabis. So we're looking for material that has total THC greater than 0.3% to be considered marijuana. And that total THC includes trans delta 9 THC, which we originally brought the method on for. We then expanded it to include the other most common THC isomers, delta 8, delta 6A, 10A, delta 10, and all of their THC acids. And then our most recent addition was the validation for Delta 7 and cis Delta 9. The drug subcommittee met, as you heard Rich Myers discuss earlier, and that review was closed to expand that validation. As for Board of Pharmacy expedited scheduling, we recommended 4 compounds in January and another 4 compounds in April of this year. And all of those 8 compounds will become scheduled on October 9th. We also recommended 2 compounds in July. Those were considered at the board's September 24th meeting and pending final approval. That is all for me. Brad, you are up.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brad Jenkins. I am the DNA Program Manager. And much like Robin, we have been busy with staffing. Director Jackson indicated that our backlogs are higher in biology and turnaround times. We're seeing a lot of that out in the Western laboratory. And we don't know the reasons behind it. They don't have an influx of additional police units out there or evidence processing units, but we are seeing a big increase of cases, around 10% in that laboratory. To a limited extent, we're also seeing increased submissions to our Northern lab. What compounds things is our Western laboratory is our smallest lab with regards to DNA staff members. And so we have 1 examiner in training out there, and we have 2 positions in recruit. We had a recent retirement out in the Western lab that we are also trying to refill. Central Laboratory, Director Jackson spoke about this, is that we have our biologist unit here. And so we have 6 folks in training in Central and 1 person in training in the data bank. Majority of those 6 folks in Central are in that biology unit, 4 in the biology unit. 1 person is in casework, and we also have a data bank position in training. Northern, we have a position in recruit, and in Eastern, fully staffed with the scientific staff there, so no movements in personnel. Since our last meeting, we've had 4 folks come off training, and so we are happy about that. Again, we believe this will help get our backlogs and turnaround times more where we want those numbers to be. So we're making good progress with that. Internal training, we're working on training with 2 examiners for TrueAllele. TrueAllele is a software program that we use on mixture analysis. One of the trainees, their mock trial or their competency exam is going to be next week projected, and the other person will be shortly behind that. We need to do some relationship training up in Northern Laboratory. We've had some staff move on to other positions, and so we have some relationship training that we need to do up there. And we're committed to training the rest of our staff to do a StarMix analysis. And again, StarMix is the type of software we use on mixture testing as well. And we are looking to start schedule those training classes. The monies for those classes, we have in a grant that just became available to us on October 1. So we're getting ready to start scheduling those classes for the remainder of the staff. We have, of 60 staff members, we have about 20 staff members who are trained in StarMix. So we have a number of other staff members to work with. Validation update, we're really focusing on some new robotics. And so we currently use the Biomet NX. And so the next version of this robot from that manufacturer is the i5. And so we have a number of these in place in all the labs, and we have, except for Western, and we have more of these robotic workstations arriving probably by the end of November. And that way all of the labs will have these workstations. Typically, you're going to have 2 of these workstations in each laboratory. We are also validating new thermocyclers. And so we make copies of the DNA with these thermocyclers, and that validation continues. The validation, the data from the thermocyclers appears to be very similar to our data from our current thermocyclers. And so that means less downstream validation or changes that we'll have to make to our procedure. So that's a positive thing. Okay, your machine is broken.
Space.
Space. How'd you do that? Huh. Learn new things every day. Hey, we want to outsource some cases. And so Director Jackson spoke about this. We had the laboratories go in and pull some cases that we thought would be appropriate to outsource. These are mostly property crime cases, possession of drugs cases, possession of weapons cases, and robbery cases. They typically consist of 1 or 2 evidence samples. They may have a suspect reference sample, they may not. And so they'll be fairly cost effective to outsource these cases, or the staff then can spend their time on processing the crimes against person cases. Private laboratory will issue a report on those cases. The data, if there's data that's available, it'll come back to us at DFS to upload in search. And before we do this, we'll send out a customer notice to our staff. But we've actively been talking about this at various Commonwealth attorney and police chief meetings. So this is not something that is unexpected to our customers. We have our continuing education meeting going on right now. Dr. Vallone, thank you. The 2 staff you sat down did a great job yesterday, so we really appreciate that. We have a number of external speakers from around the country. We're really focusing on the new recommendations and or standards that have come out from the OSAC. And so we're working on the human factors recommendations that came out today. That's the main part of the topic of the day coming on. And so we're appreciative to all our speakers. I think next year we are going to have our continuing education with the MAFS meeting that will be in Richmond. And Kim and LaShonda are my 2 staff members down in the Eastern Laboratory have organized our meeting, and they've done a great job. I can't believe we were successful in doing this. So when I came here as a baby DNA examiner many years ago, we had to do tables of our typing results. And we did these for 30 years. And we had a part of the Code of Virginia that indicated that we would provide these charts. And so it was governed by the Code of Virginia. And we had a code change that we put into place. And we're appreciative for the legislators who took that forward. But we're able to take these charts out of our certificates of analysis. And so we sent out a customer notice. We did that July 1. And we've always told our customers that if you'd like a chart of the typing results, I probably shouldn't say this, but we said, if we like a chart, let us know and we'll provide that information for you. And knock on wood, we've had very few requests for the typing results. We thought we were going to get hundreds of requests a week, and that has not occurred. So that has been a smooth transition. We wanted to do this. We're trying to respect the privacy, treat the data as private for the DNA typing results. We have suspects, we have victims, we have boyfriends in there, et cetera. And so part of that is a privacy type thing. Another issue is that moving to probabilistic modeling, the charts are not very reflective of how we make conclusions anymore. There's a whole lot of extra DNA or extra information that's taken into account. And so the charts we find may be misleading or not very informative nowadays with the type of DNA analysis that we do. So we've been pleasantly surprised at how well that's worked out so far. We just had to go out and remind, we have a partnership with the Attorney General's office, and they've been outsourcing cases since 2016. And a lot of these were on the sexual assault kit initiative. So several thousand sexual assault cases have been outsourced since that time. And we had to send a reminder out to agencies that, hey, we're outsourcing these cases. MOUs have to be put in place. And some of the data is generated, you cannot put in a CODIS. And so we had some issues with some agencies saying, hey, we really want to be able to search this data, and we couldn't search it because it was done outside our MOU. And so we really wanted to remind our customers of this practice, and that you really have to be careful about the data that you outsource. And we're happy to talk to you about that, but there's MOUs and checks and balances that you have to put in place. And so we did send out a customer notice in August about that. And we've been getting out information on investigative genetic genealogy. We don't really see that we're going to be doing this testing in-house and training people to do this type of testing in-house. This is a great test that can really help to identify people, but it's also a wonderful test to outsource. And so we're going to help our agencies do that. If they choose to outsource, we can review the data. We can make recommendations on what piece of evidence this might be best for, but we're not going to get involved in reviewing or constructing the family trees and that sort of information, or doing any of the SNP analysis. And before we do all this, we want to make sure we have a good CODIS, a good DNA profile that we can put into CODIS. And so we've been reaching out to labs, making that more visible, that we can help with this process. A number of really good successes in Virginia. We have a case going to trial up in Stafford in next month, we believe, it solved 2 unsolved homicides from 20, 30 years ago. Rapid DNA, this is the exciting part of forensic biology that we've been looking forward to, is that these instruments are in place with 2 different police agencies, Virginia State and Fairfax. They have different instruments, and they can use these instruments at the scene. They'll do some work to identify unidentified human remains, and then submit that paperwork or those reports to the medical examiner. At this point, though, we cannot search those samples in CODIS. We practice the best practices as published by the FBI, the A swab, B swab, that will test a second sample, the best sample, if they need a crime lab report. And this is the exciting part that's coming up. The FBI has come up with their new draft standards and the changes to the quality assurance standards. There's some non-rapid DNA based changes, but most of the changes in the standards that they are proposing would allow us to accept that data from these instruments and search that data in CODIS to see if we have any matches. But there's a lot of things that we have to put in place, and they're listed out here. I'm not going to read over them unless you have specific questions, but we would have to do validation and training and that sort of thing. And so we are pretty excited about this. We're going to be working with state police on this project and using one of their instruments. It's an Andy instrument. And we're waiting. There's a new chip that has to come out. So the chip holds, basically the DNA testing is done on this chip. And there's a new chip that has to come out and be available that we're going to validate and see what types of cases that validation will support for us accepting that data generated by these instruments. And so that is an exciting future topic. And Sam is next, unless there are any questions.
Hey, Brett, I had a quick question. Were you guys working with a new quant kit? Was there a validation on that from our last discussion? I can't remember.
Yeah, that's still coming out your way. We had a QAS audit this morning, and not this morning, but this summer, and they went through all that validation already, Pete. And so I do owe you that, but it's gone through a QAS external audit validation. And so, but it is coming your way.
Okay. And I know you guys published a paper in JFS with your star mix TrueAllele results. And I'm just kind of curious if you get any feedback or how, any comments on the paper or how that's going.
Right, we got some positive feedback, and it's actually hasn't been a lot of negative comments, but Susan did a lot of good work on that, and we got some positive feedback from that. So we appreciate that. her efforts on that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I have a quick question too, just on the rapid DNA. Are you planning to bring both instruments online and have them available to line up with whatever the agencies choose to purchase?
Wow, that's a good question. My thoughts is yes, that we would try to support both instruments. I think the question becomes, what if you get more than 2 instruments? What if you get 3 or 4? Our decisions going to have to be made that we cannot support all these instruments. And so that is what some of the finance people are asking questions. So as of right now, with 2 players in the field, I would like to try to support both if we can financially. But if that field becomes more crowded, we may have to make some decisions and only support, the one we think is the best or whatever the case may be. But nonetheless, both would have to be validated. So that validation is going to have to support that both instruments are working equally well.
Thank you. And I just also want to commend your strategy on outsourcing the volume crimes over the sexual assaults or, more serious crimes to a private company. I think a lot of people do the opposite way. And I think your plan makes a lot of sense.
It's the best idea I've had in a long time. So I appreciate that. But no, we are with you in talking some to the public lab, the private labs that do this, you can get really your best bang for the buck and work in some of these simpler cases versus the complex mixtures that you may run into with the sexual assault kits. So I am with you on that, and we think it'll work out well. So stay tuned. We'll let you know.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.
Hey, Brad, this is Kathy. I just have a question, kind of tagging off of Aaron's comment about the outsourcing. I agree. I think it's a great idea. I just want to ask if you've considered what you will do with those cases if they end up going to court. So do your customers realize that they may have to pay to have these outsourced agencies come to testify, or do you have a plan to possibly retest if something's going to court? Just wondering if you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so we build that into the contract, a certain amount of testimonies and payment into the contract. So we do think now we may have to build a larger portion into that contract with the Arizona Smith decision that comes out. And we may have to do retesting, but we may have to revisit that retesting. And is it truly retesting of the evidence, or is it a re-review of all the data that's generated to issue our own report? And so in the past, we've already retested the evidence. That's what biology has done. And so we may have to revisit retesting to make it more like a tox retesting where it's a data analysis. And so we're still working through that, but you bring up a very good point. And I think we're going to have to build in more monies to pay for testimony.
Thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Vallone, you have a question too?
Just a comment for Brad too. I know there was a multi-lab study on the rapid systems, the Thermo and the Andy, between different stakeholders in NIST and FBI. I can just let you know that they submitted those papers last week. So those should be out in the next couple of hopefully weeks or months. And it just talks about the performance of both the systems with casework, like mock casework type samples. So that should be out hopefully in a few months, but I can let you know when those come out.
That's excellent. Dr. Vallone, what machine do you like what instrument do you like the best?
The cheaper one?
That is a very good answer.
We have
go
ahead.
That's very good info. We're curious. We hear very good stories from the vendors, but we're happy. We're looking forward to trying them out ourselves to see which ones we like.
Yeah. We have a Thermo system, and it's because we don't have a high throughput here. It's just for research. That just does one swab at a time. That's what we have now.
Gotcha.
Thanks.
Thank you for sharing.
Ms. Ramirez, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a comment for Brian. I would echo just have two vendors. We've had experience when you only go with one vendor, that price of that one unit will exponentially go up because there's only one available, and that can really lead to a sole source. So having two vendors creates a healthy competition. And just to give you just the thinking down the road, 3 years, 6 years, 7 years, I think it's best to really have at least two vendors that you are working with to be able to have a very competitive product. And you won't have to go the one direction with one vendor or another. So just my 2 cents from our past history that we've had issues with kind of vendors.
Very good information. Thank you. All right, I'm
Yeah,
gonna turn it over to, another one.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I don't see any other, so
Oh,
I
great.
think you're
Thank
right.
you.
We can turn it over. Thank you, Brad.
Morning, everyone. I'm Samantha Glass, the Physical Evidence Program Manager, and it's always fun to follow Brad. The areas that fall under my umbrella are latent prints and impressions, firearms and tool marks, and digital and multimedia evidence. So as you've heard, both through other presenters and some of the other section updates, latent prints has additionally had some staffing concerns. Our supervisor in the Northern Lab has taken another position. That is currently in recruit. We were able to hire a qualified latent examiner in our Eastern Laboratory. She is working through an expedited training program, hopefully to be completed in January. Additionally, so those things have happened. There are some things that we expect to happen because we have recently learned that our other 2 examiners in Northern will also be taking other positions. So those positions will be posted soon as well. There is currently a trainee in background and coming soon in the Central Laboratory, and one of our current latent print examiners who is cross-training in impressions should be completed with that training by the end of the year. Continuing education-wise, the latent print section meeting was held September 16th through the 18th in the Eastern Laboratory, involved teachbacks from some of the professional meetings that have happened both regionally and the overall IAI. And we also had some voices from returning DFS people come back to teach some of those classes, which was a nice reminder of friendly faces. And we are currently planning an impression section meeting to be held October 22nd, 21st, and that will involve some going up to the FBI laboratory to see some of how they do things and what kinds of equipment we might be looking forward to expand some of our impressions documentation. We continue to be working with Virginia State Police on the upgrade to the AFA system, which was deployed in February. Troubleshooting to that is ongoing. However, we have moved with the vendor away from the initial assessment of how it was going into the more monitoring and support portion. So that means we don't have the weekly meetings anymore, but we're working more through our regional reps. In the firearms and tool marks side of the house, staffing, we had a NIBIN examiner in our Northern Lab qualified in July, and an additional NIBIN examiner in our Eastern Lab resigned in September. So those have made some moves into the recruiting. You can see we are searching for people everywhere. Here are the updated numbers for the NIBIN potential associations that have been made. This was as of September 19th throughout the year. There have only been 8 hits that were sent back to be confirmed in our laboratories, but overall we've had almost 4,000 since the system was received in 2002. Part of the reason that some of those numbers have gone down is more and more local agencies are getting NIBIN equipment of their own. The additions to this slide are on the right side. Henrico is now online, and everyone after them are new and in the process of working those cases on their own. So we're starting to see, as Director Jackson mentioned, lowering of cases just for NIBIN entry, which is increasing the number of comparison cases and therefore increasing the number of the amount of turnaround time on the back end. One thing that we're looking with in the firearms and tool mark section that might help some of these turnaround times
And we did some of this during their section meeting, which was also held at the Eastern Laboratory in September. And that was September 23rd to the 25th. We had one sole day devoted to basically discussions of 3D technology, virtual microscopy. We had some vendors in showing their products, trying to ascertain what direction we want to go in that way. The vendor with the new microscope cameras was there to show the examiners the potentials for increased quality of documentation. And there are discussions ongoing about how we can connect those cameras so that people can look at the same images under the microscope between the laboratories, and maybe they can have consultations and possibly in the future verifications without having to move evidence around. But on top of the cameras, we are evaluating the various 3D technologies for virtual comparison microscopy and figuring out which one of those vendors might best suit our needs. The digital and multimedia evidence staffing update, they are now fully staffed and have enjoyed the addition of a forensic laboratory specialist who's doing a lot of the evidence triaging when it comes in to make sure that those items are either powered off or powered on as appropriately and getting the casework paperwork started. These are also some of the projects that they're looking toward. Particularly want to talk about looking into using read-only flash drives, as we've been having trouble moving away from the multi-layer Blu-ray discs because it's getting harder and harder to find those discs as well as readers. So some of the things that they are looking into may also impact other sections that use the media as well, because our DNA sections, our latent prints and impression people often put things on optical discs as well to return to the customers. So some of these methods might be more applicable across the board. And I'm happy to take any questions you have for me now, or I can turn you over to Dr. Hutchings. All right, Jim.
Good morning. Jim Hutchings, Toxicology Program Manager. So looking overall for our methodology, we really haven't added anything major in the last few months. We do have a lot of projects in progress, like you saw with Elka's slides. There's a lot of work going on in the chemistry research section. Some of it's looking at adding new compounds. Some of it's looking at efficiency and other practices to increase our throughput. So here you can see we still have some nitazene projects we're working on. The miscellaneous base drugs, the novel psychoactives, and the blood alcohol. We're looking at some efficiency and minor changes to methodology. And then the hallucinogens, the addition of the hallucinogens to our scope is a big one there to kind of cover some areas that we've lacked in the last few decades. Staffing wise, in our central lab, we don't have any vacancies, but we have 2 forensic toxicologists in training there. Those 2 forensic toxicologists are due to some movements of other forensic toxicologists. In our Western lab, we're looking to hire a forensic toxicologist and a scientist. I believe the scientist one is in recruit and a potential offer is being put out. In our Eastern lab, we did have some departures, so we are recruiting a forensic scientist and a forensic lab specialist. In breath alcohol, we did have the retirement of Shelley Billiter. And Rebecca Daner was promoted to group supervisor, so we have to fill in Rebecca Daner's forensic scientist position. And we also have one other recruitment in DTS, and Division of Technical Services, for a forensic lab specialist. That one is pending background investigation. And this is the position that will do the ELISA screening of our de-identified impaired driving cases that only had alcohol and cannabinoid screening done. As Dr. Jackson mentioned, we did have the 2 grants received for the breath alcohol. One allows us to offer our licensing and training for our operators and to retain 1 forensic scientist. And then in toxicology, that one allows us to retain about 8 FLSs across the section to help with just general lab processes, keep us efficient. Again, looking at some stats as far as numbers, looking at the first half of 2024, looking at some projections. Our cases are about on track for what they were last year. We don't expect to see vastly different numbers compared to last year. Looking at things of note here, this is again looking at the cases of the THC screening for cases that we used to call our high alcohol content ones, the ones that are 0.10 or greater. Looking at the number of quantifiable cases, on average, you see about 25% of those cases that are the high alcohol cases do have quantifiable THC. One thing to note is that we have had a reduction in our inconclusive results, and that was due to some of the methodology that came out of our chemistry research section that allowed us to separate out the Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC cases in the blood samples. Looking at the breath alcohol side of things, you can see the overall evidential test over time. We did a major dip around the COVID time. We're starting to creep back up a little bit, and looking at projections for 2024, we should be on track to be comparable to 2023. And also with breath alcohol, we still are in the procurement process for our new instruments. It's a complicated procurement process, took a lot longer than we expected. And we're anticipating getting that contract executed before the end of the year. So that's it for me. Any questions?
All right, no questions. Thank you all very much. I also would like to congratulate the laboratory for their continued accreditation. It's great. The next item of business is old business, and I'm going to call on Ms. Jenkins to provide a report on the review project, please.
Good morning. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I do not have any slides. I was just going to talk through this. I'm going to bother you with slides on Smith v. Arizona, so we figured we would only traumatize you once. Okay. I am happy to report on our progress over the summer on the review of Mary Jane Burton's cases. I will tell you that the living has not been easy this summer at DFS. We have been extremely busy in trying to work and get into a position to be able to provide as many results as we can, to understanding that this is going to be a project that's going to take some time. I'm going to do the internal progress report. Christina Arrington is following up with the Virginia State Crime Commission to talk with you about the overall numbers. We have had an incredibly wonderful working relationship with the Crime Commission staff, and we totally appreciate all of their support that they have provided us, and I know will continue to provide us as we work through making the notifications that we need to make, that you've directed us to make on these cases. We started with meeting with really potential information sources at the beginning of the summer. Kristen Howard and I went out. She is the executive director of the Crime Commission. We went out and talked with, along with Director Jackson, to the Commonwealth Attorney Services Council on April 14th. Kristen and I went to the Virginia Sheriff's Association on April 25th. We talked with the Association of Chiefs of Police, members of their staff and their executive director on May 28th, and also the Virginia Court Clerks Association on May 30th, to kind of give them an overview of what was occurring, indicate that they would be receiving inquiries about these cases, requesting their assistance in the notification process. We also followed up with at the CASC, the Commonwealth Attorneys Summer Council, or Services Council Summer Conference, rather, on August 3rd. And then we also went back to the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police on August 27th. Director Jackson spoke there, and also we answered questions about this review as well. We've also provided information to the Forensic Science Academy Alumni Association. A lot of those police officers that are trained in the academy are also the ones that are being tapped to take a look at these notifications as they go out. So we wanted to make sure that they had that information available as well. On June 4th, we sent out a preliminary email to law enforcement through the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police, the Virginia Sheriff's Association, and the Commonwealth Attorney Services Council, letting them know that we were getting ready to issue a large batch of law enforcement notifications on these cases. And then those were mailed out, hard copies of those were mailed out on June 12th. It was 174 law enforcement agencies and 125 localities We included in those notifications a list of affected cases for each agency and locality, as well as copies of the certificates of analysis for each case that had been prepared by Mary Jane Burton. We thought that they would get more information by seeing the actual hard copy of the certificate of analysis than what they may get from just a plain list of cases. We also highlighted cases that in a preliminary run, the Crime Commission had been able to utilize information provided by the Virginia Department of Corrections that a particular individual may be incarcerated on those cases, so that law enforcement would know that those should be priority as far as their review. That was a director's office wide week-long sabbatical where everyone got involved, even the director. I put her to work sorting and providing assistance on putting those notifications together. There was a big batch that went out on June 12th. We have received responses from those. We're right at about 26 jurisdictions now responding, either the Commonwealth's attorney responding or law enforcement responding or both. Some provided immediate information on the potentially incarcerated individuals and said, Amy, we'll get back with you about the non-incarcerated individuals. A lot of these agencies have been hit with, 100, 200, 300 cases. So it's going to take some time for us to get all those responses back. They have to devote the resources. I know one particular jurisdiction that has brought in an intern specifically to work on reviewing these cases. And it usually involves clerk's office assistance as well to try to provide us with conviction information on these particular cases. So I'm anticipating we will see more in by the end of the year. We will also wind up sending out just a reminder email. I think some agencies thought, hey, if we don't have any information on this, we don't need to respond back, but we do need to know that they don't have records that far back, or they don't have any conviction information for that particular individual, because we can mark that as no record found. So we'll remind them of that in the next couple of weeks. During the Crime Commission's initial file review, they did note that there were 4 cases with tape down evidence that they felt should have been included in the original post-conviction project when they began to review some of these. 2 of those 4, it appears that they were missed because the jurisdiction was misidentified. We did not have the proper jurisdiction queried for conviction information. It was a case where like, for example, it might have been a state police case where we assumed that the jurisdiction was the same as that regional office for the state police, when in fact it was another jurisdiction we should have queried in order to get that information. For the 3rd case, the final conviction order actually wasn't made part of the order book, those old order books that were utilized before computers. Which is where these cases were. So the clerk had initially indicated no record was found, and on a subsequent query located this final conviction order for us. There was a 4th case where initially we thought perhaps this should have been included, but when we did further digging, it was determined that it was not a conviction. So that testing had started on that, but we decided to pull that back, and we notified the defendant that it was not, in fact, a conviction for that offense. So those were put into PC testing. We will handle those as we did with the original PC project, where the results will be shipped out both to all of the parties, both to the prosecutor, law enforcement, and also to the defense. And UVA Innocence Project has been notified of those. As you might recall, they were assisting us with the potentially incarcerated individuals for notifications and for assistance for legal advice. We then started on inmate notifications, and August 2nd, the Crime Commission shared with us the final spreadsheet that they had on potentially incarcerated individuals for purposes of starting those notifications. We worked with BSCC to verify those convictions before sending out notifications to potentially affected individuals. 32 of those cases have been redlined. on the spreadsheet because the individual was not charged, not convicted. We've been notified that they are deceased, or the individual listed does not appear to be the individual involved in the case. When we did a deep dive into demographic information, it just did not match. A lot of times if you've got a junior and a senior, it may be that the junior is incarcerated, but it was the senior that was convicted of the offense. And then there have been some potential name changes. And then there's some very common names that we're just trying to root out who actually was convicted of the offense, as opposed to who is incarcerated. So we're working through each of those to verify conviction status. We have been able to verify convictions with the assistance of the Commonwealth's attorney's offices and the Crime Commission in 75 cases, and those come back to 65 individuals. So an individual may have multiple cases. Notification letters have been sent to those 65 individuals with copies to the UVA Innocence Project so that they know they might be contacted by that particular individual for assistance. We still have queries on about 35 cases pending. Some of those 35 cases, the individuals have already been notified because they have other MJB cases, but we're working to verify those as quickly as possible. And I really hope to have all of those reviews completed by the end of October, so that we can say that any potentially incarcerated individual has been accounted for and has received notifications if required. I also indicated to you we were going to do a tablet notification. This was a very general notice that went out to all of the inmates incarcerated in the Virginia Department of Corrections, that if they were incarcerated on an offense that occurred between 1973 and 1988 that was worked by Mary Jane Burton, or they thought Mary Jane Burton may have worked the case, that they could reach out to me to see if they should be included in this review. And I did get a number of letters from inmates, and I anticipate I'll get a number of additional letters from inmates. To date, I've gotten 27 inmates that have written me and indicated they thought that they should be included. 5 of those inmates should be included in the review, and they have been added on and have received a notification that they're included, and that notification has gone on to the UVA Innocence Project. One inmate has been notified, had written to me when he was already notified. He was qualified for the review. The letters might have passed in the mail. 17 inmates who made inquiries do not appear to qualify. Either their offense was not worked by MJB, or it's much later than MJB was working cases at all. So they received a notification. The remaining 4, I need to do some additional research to determine if they qualify or not. And it may be I've asked the inmate to provide some additional information in order to make that determination. We had a working group meeting again, that group of stakeholders that we put together on September 6th to solicit and receive feedback on the process. The only additional, I provided the same kind of information to them as well as the Crime Commission going through the information that Dr. Arrington's getting ready to provide you. The only additional feedback that they really requested during the course of the meeting was that we might want to send out a notice to the defense bar, just in general to see if the defense bar has any cases that they might recall that Mary Jane Burton worked. I have not sent that out yet. I will send it out in the next couple of weeks, and we'll try to cover all of the major defense bar organizations and also work through the Virginia State Bar to try to get that notification out. Those practitioners would be even older than me. The question of whether they're still working or have retired and can recall the specific defendants' names is always the issue there. Next steps that we're going to work on between now and your April meeting is we're going to continue to identify individuals that have been convicted. Then we will begin locating those individuals and sending notification letters, moving on to that group that were convicted but are not incarcerated. Back when we did the PC project, we did multiple mailings of, we sent a postcard of, are you potentially the affected individual? Do you want a copy of your results? Because they were sending out actual DNA results in the PC testing project. We would do return receipt requested, then we would follow up with the letter with the results. In this instance, we're not sending out anything that is as confidential as DNA results. We're simply sending a letter saying, hey, your case might be subject to review. You also need to, follow up with this with a lawyer of your choosing, because UVA IP has not agreed to serve for this larger body of affected individuals. So we're not going to really spend that time and that amount of resources to send out multiple mailings. It will just be one mailing of that notification letter, and then we'll see if it's returned to us, or if we get an individual saying, hey, this is not me, we'll try to locate a better address for that individual. But there just doesn't seem to need to be the level of confidentiality that we had with the PC results being mailed out. It's going to be similar to the letter that you already approved for the incarcerated individuals, minus that notification going to UVA IP because they have not agreed to serve in that capacity. So it will be simply, we encourage you to locate an attorney of your choosing. I also will add in language indicating that I cannot provide them with legal advice. That's my ethical obligation as the lawyer for the agency. So they don't assume that I am representing them in any kind of capacity, because sometimes that mistake is made when they receive a letter from me. We only intend to notify living individuals who were convicted of an offense where Mary Jane Burton performed the analysis, unless you direct me differently. It has been raised that we should notify next of kin of these defendants. I hear that, but I don't feel like there's any kind of remedy for next of kin right now. There may be something considered by the General Assembly during the course of the General Assembly session. We may come back and revisit the issue if they open it up. But right now, under the law, the only individual that can ask for retesting or that can ask for their conviction to be reviewed, it would be the defendant. There is no next of kin rights for those individuals. As a practical matter, it's very easy to say you should notify next of kin, but I will tell you, from the onus being on us to find these individuals, we have no date of birth, we have no social security number. Sometimes these individuals, the names are very, very common. It is a real struggle to find the living defendants with the limited information that we have available. Certainly we've got the PC projects has already laid some of the groundwork for some of these affected individuals, but we're going to struggle with whoever was not in the PC project to be able to determine conviction status, and then to locate a valid address for those that were convicted and are still living. So I would not want to take on next of kin with the current resources that we have. Which is me, by the way. I am the resources that we have and our staff. So we're just at a point where if you want us to do that, we're going to have to seek additional resources. But I also want you to understand the limitations that are there in being able to identify next of kin for defendants on these old cases. It's reality. We remain committed to offering DNA testing that shows with the 3 individuals that we identified that should have been included with the PC testing. We immediately initiated testing on that, and we'll report those results out. If the parties agree on testing, if court orders are entered, we will certainly process evidence, whatever is available, and offer advice and guidance on what we think the best testing route might be to get the most probative results, anything that is sought after by the parties or ordered by the courts. UVA IP has been great to work with. Jenny and Juliet are remaining involved and are asking questions. They'll be provided access to all of the files that they need and all of the information they need, as well as any of the attorneys that are assisting with them on that side of the house. The Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project has also been here. Sharon Armbrust has been here reviewing the exonerated and the executed files so that they can provide you with some feedback on those particular files. I know that you were interested in that. Sean has been through the exonerations, is formulating her results on that. She's going to work through the remainder of those files and should be able to be available for your April meeting to provide feedback on all of that as well. I've provided her with access to whatever she needs from our office to be able to do that. So that's kind of a very long overview. I have one more thank you to give. Our senior legal assistant, Jess Norton, has been pulling files like crazy out of SRC, has been managing spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and has been working with both Christina Arrington and with Sharon Armbrust to facilitate their file review. And she has been fabulous, and this has been a lot of extra added onto her plate too, and I greatly appreciate it. And I know DFS does, as well as the SAC membership. So that's all I've got, unless you have any questions for me.
Amy, I have a question, just so I can understand one thing is, so after the defendant's been notified, and if they reach out and say, I'd like my case to be looked at, and if there is no evidence to be retested, is that case file documentation being reviewed by anyone? Or are we only looking at cases where there's evidence to retest?
We have not set up for a review of those serology results. You know, I think the thought process previously was that DNA testing is probably the best way to get at it. It may be that as the project unfolds and we figure out how many cases we're dealing with where there is no evidence to retest, there's only serology results to review, that we need to come back to you and say what place for this. I think probably the General Assembly session will also give us some idea of how the legislature would like to proceed with the review of these cases as well, whether or not they're going to provide an automatic right of renewal or what they're going to do on these types of cases as well. So we'll have to follow that as well. The biggest thing I think for the next few months is for us to determine the affected individuals and get them notified. So you can certainly change course or provide us with more guidance as we go along.
Thank you. Appreciate all the work that you and all the staff there has done on this, as well as all the groups that are helping. If there's no other questions, I would call on Dr. Christina Arrington to provide an overview of the Mary Jane Burton cases.
Can everyone hear me? And can everyone see the handout on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. Today, I'll provide a brief overview of the handout you received from us. As you can see, it starts with the budget language passed in this year's General Assembly session, directing the Crime Commission to determine the scope and nature of cases where forensic testing or analysis was performed by Mary Jane Burton. In January of this year, DFS provided us with a spreadsheet containing all certificates of analyses in their agency's historic case file project, where Miss Burton was indicated as the forensic examiner. And in the time since we provided our last update to you in April, we were able to determine a reliable way to collapse all the certificates of analyses into unique cases, which is a much better metric for determining the scope and workload of this project. So to date, we believe that there are 7,572 unique cases where Ms. Burton was the forensic examiner, of which 3,391 of these included at least one named suspect. Thus far, we have identified 4,191 named suspects across these 3,391 cases. We were also asked to determine how many of the cases had an indication of scientific testimony from Ms. Burton. Thus far, out of the 7,500 cases, we have found 174 cases that have an indication of such testimony. In terms of the number of cases in this current project that overlap with the previous work in the post-conviction DNA project, we have linked approximately half of the named suspects to that earlier project, which is great news as we will generally have the conviction, testing, and notification status documented for those individuals. Now, in terms of our work plan, to meet the directives of the budget language, our first step is to collect and verify information in the case files with a named suspect, including defendant PII and information relating to the offense, such as the offense date, offense type, and investigating agency. We have thus far completed this step for groups A, B, and C, where the named suspect was identified as potentially being incarcerated or under DOC supervision, as well as those cases where there was an indication of scientific testimony being provided by Ms. Burton. After these two groups, we plan to continue with our case file review for groups D and E. Most of the files are readily available for Group D since they were part of the prior PC project. However, the vast majority of Group E will need to be requested from the State Library of Virginia. Now, because we didn't want any delays, we immediately moved to steps 2 and 3 for those who were identified as potentially being incarcerated for an offense where Ms. Burton was the examiner. Ms. Jenkins has already discussed this group in detail, but we certainly want to thank the Virginia Department of Corrections, the Virginia Parole Board, and the individual circuit court clerks and Commonwealth attorneys who helped us confirm whether these individuals were convicted and currently serving a term of incarceration per the named victim in each case. We will begin a similar verification and notification process for individuals identified as potentially being under DOC supervision to determine if they are indeed currently under supervision for the pertinent case and named victim or victims. And then in regards to the last two groupings, E and F, as Ms. Jenkins noted, the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project and DFS, they're completing a joint review of those individuals identified as being either executed or exonerated. And finally, the last page of the handout is essentially an illustration of what I just discussed. The orange box at the top shows the total number of cases, that 7,500 number, which is then broken into two groupings, the 4,181 without a named suspect and the 3,391 with a named suspect, as shown in the two dark blue boxes. The cases with a named suspect are the main focus at this point in time, with the goal of determining the conviction status for each of the 4,191 individuals named across these cases. And then for those individuals determined to be convicted, having each classified into one of the categories listed in the bottom row of the chart is seen in the light blue, whether they're currently incarcerated, under DOC supervision, having served their sentence, or are deceased, executed, or were exonerated. As of today, we have confirmed 946 convictions, 321 non-convictions, with a conviction status of 2,924 yet to be determined. For those 946 convictions, we have determined that 65 individuals across 75 cases are currently incarcerated for at least one offense where Ms. Burton was the forensic examiner. We also know at this point that 237 individuals are deceased as determined by research in the earlier PC project, with an additional 16 individuals who were executed and another 10 individuals determined to be exonerated in cases worked by Ms. Burton. That leaves us with those under DOC supervision, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the next step in the work plan, so we can determine the number of definitive individuals and cases falling under this category, And finally, the remainder will be those who are presumed to be alive, but who have completed serving any type of sentence for an offense where Ms. Burton was the forensic examiner. And that is the Crime Commission's update as of today, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Arrington. We appreciate that review.
You're welcome.
And the work. All right. So I think this brings us to the new business segment of the meeting. And I first will call on Ms. Jenkins to discuss the Smith v. Arizona decision.
It's me again. So the director asked me to kind of give you all an overview of Arizona v. Smith, and I'm going to spend a little bit less time talking about the law than I normally would and more about really what the department's response has been. She thought you might find it interesting to hear how we're working through the issue of Smith v. Arizona. So let's start with an overview of the case and what the lawyers love to call the issue rule analysis and conclusion, which is how we all get through law school. So Smith was basically a case that was appealed out of the Arizona trial court, made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It dealt with drug offenses where the original examiner had left the Arizona Department of Public Safety laboratory after she had completed the analysis. Rather than bringing her back for whatever reason, the Arizona DPS offered up another individual who worked for Arizona DPS, and that individual had reviewed both her report and the notes, and then he testified, providing his expert opinion at trial about the drugs and that they were controlled substances during the course of the trial proceedings. He came to the same conclusions as was outlined by the original examiner, and he came to those conclusions in reliance on both her original report prepared for court and the notes, and that's really kind of important, that reliance on those original report and notes. So the question became in front of the Supreme Court, was that a violation of the defendant's right to confront and cross-examine the witnesses that are testifying against him? And does that violate the Confrontation Clause of the Sixth Amendment? When, as the expert is testifying and providing the basis of his opinion, he is providing hearsay evidence from that other original examiner. And what the court held is, aside from the Arizona Rules of Evidence, which is Arizona Rule of Evidence 703, it is parallel to the Federal Rules of Evidence 703, that even though under the Rules of Evidence, an expert can testify and utilize hearsay evidence as the basis for their testimony, that may be allowed under the Rules of Evidence, but that is not allowed under the Sixth Amendment Confrontation Clause. The constitutional rights are always going to trump the rules of evidence. So that when that expert was conveying the original examiner's statements, out of court statements in support of his opinion, those statements were provided because they were provided to prove the truth of the matter asserted, which gets into some hearsay stuff we're going to talk about in a second. And they came into evidence for the truth, and that was a violation. The big hiccup was Arizona had already conceded basically that those out of court statements were testimonial, which is where we get into the Sixth Amendment analysis. Director, if you can advance the slides. So it's helpful to know a little bit of hearsay, although a little bit of hearsay will go a long way. And it is a complicated legal issue. What constitutes hearsay, what constitutes, and it confuses the judges and the lawyers on a regular basis. So if you as a scientist are like, I can't really work this out in my head, that's okay. It's really mostly for the lawyers to work out what's hearsay and what's not hearsay, and hopefully get that correctly communicated to the court. And that's kind of what we have told our staff is that you need to allow them to allow the lawyers to argue this out and not be caught up in that piece. But hearsay is generally a statement other than one made by the declarant, offered to prove that's made outside of court and is offered to prove the matter asserted. So my example that I utilized with staff when I talked about this just yesterday was that, you know, if you are on the stand and you're testifying as an examiner in the forensic lab setting, that someone else, you know, say you're on the stand and you say, Mrs. Smith, you know, accessioned the evidence and sampled that gun for DNA. And, you know, there is hearsay involved there, whether it's Mrs. Smith telling you orally that she sampled the gun and providing you with the sample, or whether it's in writing, you know, in the notes that are kept during the course of that analysis that Ms. Smith is documenting, I accessioned the evidence and I sampled that gun for DNA. It can even be nonverbal conduct. The example that I offer for that is actually one of the cases that was in the podcast. That's the Stevenson case. And that was the instance. And if you all might recall back to that October meeting, there was a sweatshirt involved in that case where or shirt rather, I think, where the police responded to the defendant's house and said to the wife, please provide the clothing that the defendant was wearing. And she didn't say anything to the defendant or to the police, but she went back, collected some clothing and came back to provide that to the police. And she was unavailable to testify at trial because of spousal privilege. But the court ruled, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, or Virginia Supreme Court rather, ruled that that was hearsay. It was offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. It was an out-of-court statement, even though it was nonverbal. She was asserting that that was the clothing that had been worn by the defendant when he came back to the house. And the court said that was not admissible. It didn't fall under any exceptions that it would allow it to be admitted into court. So the evidence that followed, which was the testing of that shirt by Ms. Burton at the time, that didn't come into evidence on retrial. So it is not as simple as it might seem, what might be hearsay, what might not. And then we have to argue through whether it's offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted or not. And so that really gets us to the overall ruling in the Smith case, that we can break it apart a little bit. And what Justice Kagan said in the majority opinion of the court is, you know, that those expert statements of the original expert who did the testing of, I took the evidence, I tested it, here were the results. Those are out of court statements. They clearly were offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted because they were relied upon by that testifying expert, the surrogate expert, if you will, who subsequently came in and provided the testimony. So the question really becomes is, if those are hearsay statements, are they testimonial? And that's the piece that the court did not get to based on the record that was in front of them for Smith v. Arizona. They remanded it to the Arizona courts to make that determination. The big hiccup was that Arizona had really pretty much conceded that they were testimonial. And on remand, sure enough, Arizona let the case drop. Which I think was a smart strategic move because the record was not really good with the testimony that was provided. And when you're at the appellate stage, you can't offer any additional evidence. You can't clean that up at all. You're stuck with the record that was made at the trial court level. The court did provide some guidance about what might be testimonial, but didn't really spell it out to really help all of us. But that's the thought process. So the extra guidance that they provided is they're focusing on, the majority's focusing on primary purpose. Thomas has always reiterated through all of these Sixth Amendment cases that he is looking to the solemnity which the document is is produced. So he looks at affidavits, he looks at things that are geared towards a substitute for trial testimony. But the rest of the court of the majority are looking at whether or not there's a primary purpose here, and whether or not it's for the purpose of substituting for trial testimony overall. But the court did look at, considering the range of record keeping that the lab analysts engage in, a lot of the documents that are generated may not be for the purposes of having that focus on court. They looked at the compliance with accreditation requirements, the facilitation of internal review, and then also reminders to self was something that was raised by one of the justices during oral argument as well. And flipping to the next slide, Linda, the real concern came for me, and I think for other lab counsel about and for other members of the forensic community about what about batch processing. Some of the language that was used by Kagan was very broad, and it was concerning about whether or not batch processing could continue with forensic laboratories. And that's been our focus in Virginia, is for the preservation of batch processing because of the importance that has to the efficiency of the forensic lab, and to be able to respond to backlogs and produce cases and keep cases moving through. And it really is a best practice for the forensic science community to have batch processing involved in some, if not all, disciplines. Here in Virginia, we've got it pretty much involved in tox is mostly entirely batch processing. There's some in DNA and forensic biology. And then we have some limited amount of instrument support in trace and controlled substances that I think would also perhaps qualify as batch processing as well. So we started with informing the Commonwealth's attorneys about the fact that there was batch processing, because I don't think the lawyers know, defense or prosecutors. I don't think they have any idea for the most part that batch processing occurs in the forensic laboratories. And I also, when we started getting the initial responses, I wanted to let them know, look, this is not something that is unknown to the Supreme Court. However, if you look back through these cases where forensic laboratory work has been analyzed on the Sixth Amendment issue, starting with Melendez-Diaz, there have been notations by the Supreme Court justices, both those currently on the court and those previously on the court, that they're not holding that everybody who touches a piece of evidence in the forensic lab needs to be called as a witness in the case, which is where some advocates immediately go to is, well, everything a forensic lab does is for purposes of court, so therefore everybody must be called to testify. And I don't think that's accurate. I think when you look at the footnote in Melendez-Diaz that was written by Justice Scalia, where he's saying, look, we're not saying that everybody that establishes chain or establishes the authenticity of a sample or the accuracy of testing devices has to come in. Sotomayor's concurrence, which she was on the majority for Smith v. Arizona, she had a footnote in her Bullcoming concurrence that talked about, look, we don't need everybody to testify that's involved in the BAC report. We need to look to who in the chain of custody is so crucial as to require them to present evidence. And then finally, Kagan herself in Williams v. Illinois, which has lost some of its luster and really didn't have a whole lot of luster because it was a plurality opinion. It wasn't a full majority of the court. But even she said in her dissent in Williams, we have never held that everybody who touches the evidence must come to court. And no opinion or none of the cases have raised the issue about how many analysts have to come to court. And that really suggests to her that there has to be a lead analyst readily identifiable. So the focus in Virginia, we have focused on is who is our lead analyst, who should be our testifying forensic witness that has provided the total analysis in the case. And, you know, Bull Cumming and Smith v. Arizona, the lead analyst did not come testify. That's very clear. They used surrogate testimony. So in responding to this, well, one more piece is I also pointed out yesterday, Justice Breyer in his Williams v. Arizona actually went through all of the different technicians that could be involved in DNA testing for Cellmark. So getting up to 13 different technicians that are involved. So they clearly have an understanding that batch processing is out there and being done. The question is always, where is that line going to be drawn about how many people are involved that need to be present for court? So we did kind of amass a response to this for purposes of kind of making sure that we didn't have knee-jerk reactions from the prosecutors, that they were just going to automatically start subpoenaing everybody who was involved in an analysis, and also responding to defense inquiries and defense arguments that everyone should be included. I don't feel like that's abandoning my position as a neutral representative of the department, to advocate for the fact that not everyone is needed to come to court. We have to be able, as an agency, to continue with batch processing. There has to be an understanding by the lawyers of how we move evidence through the department, and why it's beneficial to everyone involved in the criminal justice system for us to be able to do that. And, you know, to show them that there is a lead analyst involved that can be utilized for these cases. We looked at the applicable case laws. There was a particular case in Virginia that everyone had forgotten about that considered batch processing shortly after Melendez-Diaz, called Aguilar versus Commonwealth, where it addressed batch processing in a DNA case in Virginia. And the Virginia Supreme Court held, look, we've got the lead analyst here. We've got the individual who wrote the report, who directed the evidence submission and handling through the department, who took all of the data that was generated by the technicians. And I think there were a couple of individuals who had been involved in that analysis, who took all of that data and all of that QA and QC and conducted the analysis and review of all of that data, and came to the conclusions that are represented in that final report that was generated for court. And that is all that we determine is needed for court, is that lead analyst to be available. There's a lot of batch processing cases available across the country, both in the federal level and at the state level. And Virginia is not the only state that has addressed the issue, and there's certainly a number of federal courts have addressed it. We had conversations with the federal laboratories about batch processing and what their intention was. I understand that DEA, ATF, and the FBI have all considered the issue and do not intend to change their batch processing. My understanding is that there will be motions in limine filed at the federal level in order to have the court rule on these in advance of trial if the defense will not stipulate. That will help generate a lot of federal law, again, on the issue in light of Smith v. Arizona, and whether that changes the court's analyses in that result. And I've also communicated with fellow lab counsel around the country about the issues as well. And we talked about it, and also held different webinars to discuss it. We talked with our staff about Smith v. Arizona, and then I began the advocacy process of writing a white paper that we distributed across the Commonwealth to prosecutors, and the list of cases that I found that were pertinent for Virginia batch processing. So all of that was distributed. At that August conference of the Commonwealth's attorneys, I talked about batch processing. I talked about Smith v. Arizona. We also met with Ms. Lohman, and I met with a special group, a working group that had been developed by the Commonwealth's Attorneys Services Council to address Smith v. Arizona, and to provide training materials for the younger prosecutors who may not be as adept at being able to argue on their feet these types of very complicated legal issues, and to give them the ability to have that information presented to them in a cohesive fashion, in a cheat sheet kind of way. So we provided all that and have been working with that working group since then. We went through toxicology, have produced a cheat sheet for toxicology and predicate questions for the examiners on those cases. And now we're working currently on forensic biology. We'll address the other issues as well, so that they have all of that worked out for them in advance. All that information is also available to the defense. We've had some of the defense bar ask for an overview of batch processing. We'll provide the same information to them as well. We'll provide some additional guidance to staff about how to make sure that they are familiarizing themselves as they go into court to be able to testify about the overall processes. The guidance that we're really giving staff is that you don't go in and testify and then Miss swap the gun, because that's hearsay. We're also providing the same guidance to the prosecutors that they should not go in and testify and ask for, tell me what happened to the gun. It should be an overview of what the process is for all of those types of evidence as they go through the department, what the procedures provide for overall for the analysis of evidence, and also what quality assurance and quality control mechanisms are in place to make sure of the quality and the reliability of that data that's generated. And then focus on that data review that is conducted by the testifying forensic witness and what they're providing, what they're provided and what they utilize to come to the conclusions that are in the report. So all of that information is kind of being communicated both outwardly and inwardly. Surrogate testimony, I would have never have taken the position that was taken by Arizona DPS as far as sending a substitute in. That's not a criticism. I just think it's a very difficult dance. And you really, probably the cleanest thing that could have occurred for Arizona was just to do a reanalysis of that evidence. And if we were contacted and did not have the ability to provide the original examiner, or the original examiner would not return for that case, we would have probably suggested a reanalysis in that issue. We have really focused on encouraging examiners to return to testify in support of the prior casework. I think Director Jackson's already talked with you about the honorarium policy that was put in place to provide some financial incentive for their return to testify in particular cases, and also providing the case documentation and all of those all that support that might be needed for a returning examiner to come back and support their casework. I've also opened up conversations with fellow lab counsel. We really need to be putting that in across the country to be able to support examiners to return. I talked with an examiner yesterday, not for us, but for another, had been an examiner for another agency, and she said the lab declined to provide my documentation to me. And I don't understand why laboratories would take that position. You want to encourage them to come back. They need to be fully prepared to take the stand. They are fully prepared when they have the examination documentation in front of them, and can rely on that and review that in order to prepare and to testify. If the examiner cannot or will not come back, we're going to do the reexaminations to the best of our ability. There are going to be some cases that are not, the evidence is not available or are not amenable. So we'll look at that complete data re-exam, pulling out the prior report of and conclusions of the prior examiner, so that, like for a toxicology batch, that re-examination is conducted the same way the original exam would have been conducted. That toxicologist that writes that report may not have participated in any of the analysis of the original evidence, but he or she has taken all of that data and produced the resulting certificate. So we do the same thing on the re-exam, pull out the report, pull out the conclusions reached by that toxicologist, have a new toxicologist review all of the data that was generated, and provide a new report. And that would be the testifying forensic witness then going forward. It's going to require a case-by-case determination on what we can do and do not do. And that would be taken up with the prosecutors as they're asking for those re-exams if we can't get the prior examiner to return. So that's kind of an overview of what we have been doing. That added to the Mary Jane stuff has made me really busy. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have on our response.
I have more of a comment than a question. I just want to commend Amy and Virginia DFS for their response to this. You have been monitoring it from the very moment that it kind of became something that the community was aware of, and informing everyone throughout the community about what it means, and really leading an objective response to it with just a lot of thought. So I appreciate that, and just wanted to commend you all for doing that work.
Mr. Bomarito?
Well, I was actually just going to echo Erin's comments that she already made. Just curious too, what type of honorarium do you offer returning testifying scientists?
So it's $500 a day, where we're assuming that you would really only need one day. And if it is something where you need consideration for more than that, whether it's that you have a very, very complicated case with a lot of, complicated mixtures of DNA and so forth, where just the preparation would take, a considerable amount of time, or if it's, where you're ending up staying in court, at the location for however many, we have a process where that can get approved. We're not paying for the travel. That's still the responsibility of the person who has subpoenaed you. And so I'm happy to share those documents. If I hadn't done that already, I can do it again. But we have not just the policy, which is really geared, it's written towards how employees at the department can kind of shepherd people through the process and get everything done that needs to be done so that they can get paid. They're being paid as a contractor, basically, as a one-off. They have to do the tax forms and all that kind of stuff. But also there's a form that is filled out by the previous employee that is sent to the laboratory director, and in agreeing to accept the honorarium, they are agreeing to properly prepare for court, make sure that they're receiving the right documentation so that that they can do so, and that they acknowledge that we could review their testimony, that kind of thing. So that's all laid out.
It's a good policy. For
DHRM rules, which is our overarching HR for the state, we're not allowed to share any contact information unless people have given us permission to do so. And so we had found that more and more people, when they were leaving the agency, were saying, no, you are not allowed to share my contact information, and therefore making it much more difficult for them to support any work that they had done. And so we're just trying to do what we can to encourage that continuation of support, when it's feasible.
I would also like to add for Ms. Jenkins that I think it's great that you're talking to other council and other agencies, because one thing that I think also needs to be addressed is if someone left your agency and went to work at a different agency, is that new agency going to give them the time off to go and testify somewhere else? So we had a couple of occasions where people that were working for us had to go back to their previous lab to testify. And we always, we didn't give them vacation time. How can I say this? We let them do it on our time, right? We didn't make them take vacation. Whereas I know some other agencies either said they had to take vacation time, or they said, you're not allowed to do it. And so I think I think it's really important that it's discussed nationwide, like Ms. Forey said, to be sure that, labs are in compliance, because it's not just gonna be you, it's gonna be all the labs you're gonna have to deal with in both directions, so. Just something to think about on that side.
Agreed. I think that should be something that should be addressed nationwide. And the conversations are, it was with North Carolina Council, and we're constantly switching examiners back and forth. That's kind of the way that goes, and we need to support each other. So he needed my help in this point in time, and I'm going to need his help at some point in time. And that's what we need to consider, is that, I really think it should be us allowing the examiners to go back on our time to testify. But then there should be some reciprocation, as far as we're going to limit the time that they're here and not make them sit for 5 days on a jury trial. They should be called in, testify, and sent back to their lab. So just like you would want if they were working in their home state.
Agreed. All right. Well, thank you so much for that. It's very helpful. I might use some of that information for my class too. So thank you. The last item of business under new business is related to an updated electronic meetings participation policy, which the members should have received the draft. There was a recent change to the Virginia public meeting laws that now requires public bodies to adopt such a policy on an annual basis. So we will be doing that moving forward. Note that in this most recent revision, there is only one change to our policy, and that is that, consistent with the recent changes to the law, the policy now reflects that public bodies may utilize all virtual meetings for up to 50% of their meetings held per calendar year. The previous maximum was 25%, or 2 meetings, whichever was greater. So it's a very slight change. It doesn't really change how often we meet virtually, but we do want to make sure that the policy is that our policy is congruent with the Virginia policy, the law. So does anyone have any questions to that policy? I don't see any hands up. So if there are no questions, I would ask if there is a motion to adopt the policy, the revised policy.
Motion to adopt the revised policy. Hold on.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Ken Zersi, second.
Thank you. I think Ms. Strobel, could you call a vote for this, please?
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Let's try this again. Mr. Beatty.
Aye.
Mr. Bomarito.
Aye.
Ms. Bro.
Aye.
Dr. Corrado.
Aye.
Mr. Demuth.
Aye.
Ms. Forey.
Aye.
Director Jackson.
Aye.
Dr. Maha.
Aye.
Mr. Myers.
Aye.
Ms. Ramirez.
Aye.
Dr. Vallone.
Aye.
Mr. Zersi.
Aye.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. The motion has passed. The next segment of the meeting is for public comment. If there are any members of the public who would like to provide comments, please raise your hand if you're in the meeting. I don't see any. Please let me know if you see someone. I'm not sure I can see everyone. It does not appear like there's any public comment at this time. The next item on the agenda is to determine future meeting dates for 2025. And I would ask Ms. Strobel to please list the proposed dates for possible consideration.
Yes, so the proposed dates are in April. That would be Tuesday, April the 22nd, 2025 at 10 a.m. That would be an in-person meeting. And in October, that would be Tuesday, the 7th at 10 a.m., which can be electronic.
All right, let's take the first one, the April 22nd meeting. Does anyone have any concerns with that date?
Just hold on a second.
Okay, sorry. I'll give you some time. Check your calendar.
The date is April
Tuesday,
22nd?
April. Yeah,
22nd.
sorry, 22nd.
I don't have an issue with that one.
Okay, so it seems like everyone's hopefully been able to check your calendar. I don't hear any issues, so I think that date should be fine. And then the second date is October 7th, 2025. Which is a Tuesday as well. Please check your calendars for that date.
Can you repeat the date?
Yes, Tuesday, October 7th.
I think the AFQAM meeting is that week, just for people to know that, if that matters.
So does anyone, thank you, Erin. Does anyone have any conflicts with that date? It will be a virtual meeting. I should point that out as well. Okay, it doesn't sound like it. So I think those dates are good. Our next meetings will be in person, April 22nd, 2025, and virtually October 7th, 2025. Believe that completes our agenda. So I want to thank everyone for their participation. It's nice to see everyone. I'm looking forward to see you in person in about 6 months. I would ask if there's a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Dr. Vallone. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second.
Second by Mr. Zersi. All in favor to adjourn the meeting, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.